You're a Portuguese sailor in the year 1492. You've just spent 3 months on a wooden ship smaller than a modern city bus, surviving on hardtack that could double as ship ballast, and water that's developed a suspicious film on top. Your navigator thinks the world is round, which, kudos to him, is actually correct. But he also thinks he's 40 days away from Japan, when he's actually about to stumble into an entirely new continent. Now here's the real question. Why would anyone voluntarily sign up for this? Welcome to the Age of Exploration, the period when Europeans decided that sailing into the middle of nowhere on what was essentially a floating coffin was somehow a fantastic career choice. It's a story of greed, glory, God, and an absolutely staggering amount of geographical misunderstanding. Today we're answering the question, what is the Age of Exploration, and why did humanity decide this was a good idea? What is the Age of Exploration? I know some of you are already typing, wait, wasn't Columbus looking for India? In the comments, we'll get there. Patience is a virtue, and frankly, you'll need it. The Age of Exploration, sometimes called the Age of Discovery, generally refers to the period from roughly the early 15th century to the mid-17th century, when European powers embarked on systematic voyages of discovery, conquest, and colonization across the globe. It fundamentally reshaped the world in ways we're still dealing with today. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't some grand, coordinated effort. There was no European Union meeting where everyone agreed, all right, let's all discover new continents together. Instead, you had several different countries, each with their own motivations, racing to find new trade routes, new resources, and new territory. It was less a carefully planned expedition, and more like the world's most high-stakes game of financial Calvin ball. The traditional starting point is often cited as 1415, when the Portuguese captured Ceuta in North Africa. A small step for Portuguese imperialism, a giant leap for, maybe we can sail around this continent somehow. The ending is a bit more debatable. Some historians point to 1648 and the Peace of Westphalia, which recognized the sovereignty of many new nations and effectively ended the old colonial order. Others say it wound down gradually throughout the 17th century, as exploration gave way to outright colonization and the establishment of permanent overseas empires. But here's the real question. Why did this happen when it did? Why weren't the Chinese or the Arabs or the Romans doing this centuries earlier? I mean, the Romans had ships. The Chinese had the largest naval fleet in the world in the early 1400s. What made Europeans suddenly say, you know what, let's find out what's behind that big ocean? The answer, as always with history, is complicated, and honestly, a little bit ridiculous. Origins. Why did it begin? Picture medieval Europe in the 14th century. You're a kingdom with a growing population, an economy that's starting to hum, and one enormous problem. You need stuff. Spices, silk, precious metals, all the good stuff that makes life worth living. But here's the catch. All of it has to come from the East, through a series of increasingly expensive middlemen who have been jacking up prices since the Roman Empire fell. During the High Middle Ages, the overland Silk Road was the primary route for Asian goods to reach Europe. But by the late Middle Ages, that route was becoming problematic. The Mongol Empire, which had kept the trade routes relatively safe, was fragmenting. The Ottoman Empire was rising and, crucially, taking control of key trade routes. By 1453, when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, they essentially told European merchants, great luck on your future endeavors, but the markup on pepper just went up 400%. So European powers had a choice. Either pay through the nose for Asian goods, find a new route, or develop alternatives. And if you're a 15th century monarch looking at your treasury, option 3 isn't really hitting right. There were actually earlier attempts to find sea routes to Asia. The Portuguese had been poking around the African coast since the 13th century, and by the early 1400s, Prince Henry the Navigator, actually let's talk about him for a second, because his nickname is absolutely hilarious when you think about it, was establishing a navigation school in Sagres, Portugal. Henry himself didn't do a ton of sailing. He was more of a venture capitalist for exploration, funding expeditions and collecting information. But Henry the Navigator sounds much cooler than Henry the guy who sat around funding other people's dangerous field trips. So here we are. There were other factors at play too. Technology had reached a point where long-distance maritime travel was becoming more feasible. The caravel, a small, highly maneuverable ship with both square and lateen sails, could sail efficiently against the wind, crucial for exploring down the African coast. The magnetic compass, the astrolabe, and improved cartography all helped. Europe was, essentially, inventing the tools it needed to become a global conqueror. And then there's the religious motivation. The Crusades may have ended in failure, but the desire to spread Christianity never really went away. Pope Nicholas V even issued a papal bull in 1455 called Dum Diversas, which basically gave Portuguese explorers permission to enslave any non-Christians they found. That's right, the Vatican literally gave a thumbs up to colonialism before colonialism was cool. It's not the best look, honestly. But the biggest driver, the thing that truly launched the age of exploration, was cold, hard cash. Spices were worth more than their weight in gold. The Portuguese figured out that if they could cut out the middlemen and get Asian goods directly, they'd make fortunes beyond imagining. And once one country started succeeding, everyone else wanted in on the action. This is what historians call the proto-globalization of trade, and it was about to get very, very intense. Let's take a quick breather, and if you're enjoying this journey through the age of exploration, now is a perfect time to hit that subscribe button and join the What Is community. We explore history, science, and the big questions that shape our world, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. There's more fascinating history coming up, so don't miss out. Next up, let's look at countries involved. The age of exploration wasn't a solo performance. It was more like an ensemble cast where everyone was trying to outdo each other, while occasionally forming alliances and absolutely constant backstabbing. Portugal was first out of the gate, and honestly, they were the heavy favourites to win the exploration race. They had the geographic advantage, situated at the southwestern tip of Europe with easy Atlantic access, and they had Prince Henry's school pumping out skilled navigators like a very ambitious nautical diploma mill. By 1488, Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that yes, you could indeed sail around Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. The Portuguese then spent the next century building an empire based on controlling key maritime choke points, from Mozambique to Goa to Malacca. Their strategy was simple: dominate the spice trade and force everyone else to pay up. Spain was the other major player, and their entry into the exploration game came with a bit of an asterisk. See, when Columbus came knocking on the Spanish court's door in 1492, he was essentially a salesman with a very questionable product. He wanted to sail west to reach Asia. The problem was that his calculations were way off. He thought the Earth was much smaller than it actually is. Fortunately for him, Queen Isabella was tired of letting the Portuguese have all the fun and all the money. She funded his expedition, largely because she figured even if he was wrong, at least she'd get some islands out of the deal. And oh, did she get islands. Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean, starting a chain of events that would lead to the complete devastation of indigenous American civilizations. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Netherlands entered the scene a bit later, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, but they made up for lost time quickly. After gaining independence from Spain, the Dutch East India Company became perhaps the most powerful corporation in history. Yes, more powerful than some actual governments. They focused on trade, establishing posts across Asia, and eventually seizing control of much of Portugal's empire when the Portuguese started to falter. England and France also got in on the action, particularly in North America. The English had their famous privateers, legally sanctioned pirates like Sir Francis Drake, who were essentially given permission to rob Spanish ships on behalf of the crown. The French focused more on fur trading and relationships with indigenous peoples, though they ultimately lost most of their North American territory to the British. But here's what's worth remembering. These weren't just friendly competitions. there were actual treaties, actual wars, and an absolute ton of geopolitical maneuvering. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, negotiated by the Pope, because apparently the Vatican was in the mood management business, divided the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal. The Portuguese got everything east of a certain line. The Spanish got everything west. It was a neat solution until everyone else started objecting, which, to be fair, was almost immediately. The competition between these nations would shape the next several centuries of world history. And it all started because a bunch of Europeans wanted cheaper pepper. Important moments, people, and discoveries. Alright, let's get into the good stuff. The age of exploration is absolutely packed with fascinating characters, improbable voyages, and moments that changed history. Let's hit the highlights. 1492. Columbus discovers America. I put discovers in quotes because obviously people were already living there. But in terms of European awareness, this was the big one. Columbus, despite being wrong about basically everything geographically, accidentally landed in the Bahamas and then Cuba, convinced until his dying day that he'd found some sort of offshore islands near Asia. His voyages initiated sustained European contact with the Americas, which led to, what's the polite term? Significant cultural and demographic changes. We'll talk about the consequences later. 1498. Vasco da Gama reaches India. This was the big prize. By sailing around Africa and across the Indian Ocean, da Gama proved that the Portuguese could directly access the spice markets of Asia. His voyage was initially met with suspicion by the Zamorin of Calicut. Imagine someone showing up in your harbor with a bunch of weapons and asking to trade. But eventually, the Portuguese established themselves in India. The economic impact was enormous. Suddenly, those middlemen weren't needed anymore. 1513. Vasco Núñez de Balboa crosses Panama. Here's a fun fact. When Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean, he was the first European to do so. He named it the South Sea because, well, it was to the south. Not the most creative naming, but honestly, after months of hacking through jungle, I think he earned a pass. 1519 to 1522. Magellan's expedition. Ferdinand Magellan's voyage is one of the most remarkable stories of the age of exploration, and also one of the most tragic. Magellan, a Portuguese sailor sailing for Spain, led an expedition to find a western route to the Spice Islands. He succeeded in crossing the Pacific, becoming the first European to do so, but was killed in the Philippines by a local chief, who frankly had excellent judgment about random strangers showing up with weapons. What's remarkable is that one of his ships, the Victoria, actually made it back to Spain in 1522, completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. Out of 270 crew members who set sail, only 18 returned, but they brought back enough spices to make the voyage profitable, which was really the only metric that mattered to the sponsors. 1524. Giovanni da Verrazzano explores the Atlantic coast. The Italian explorer, sailing for France, became the first European to explore the Atlantic coast of North America, between Florida and Newfoundland. His voyage established French claims to North America and provided detailed descriptions of the region that would later become the United States. 1532 to 1533. Francisco Pizarro conquers the Inca. This is where the age of exploration starts to get genuinely dark. Francisco Pizarro, a Spanish conquistador, led a small band of soldiers to overthrow the Inca Empire, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas. Through a combination of superior weapons, strategic deception, and what can only be described as extreme biological warfare, the Spanish inadvertently introduced diseases like smallpox that devastated indigenous populations. The Inca were conquered within a few years. The gold alone that the Spanish seized was worth millions by modern standards. 1588. The Spanish Armada. Not strictly an exploration story, but hugely important. When Spain attempted to invade England, the English, utilizing faster, more maneuverable ships and taking advantage of bad weather, defeated the supposedly invincible Spanish fleet. This shifted the balance of naval power and opened the door for English and Dutch dominance in subsequent centuries. 1607 to 1735. The age of colonization expands. As exploration gave way to permanent colonization, Europeans established settlements across the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia. Jamestown, Plymouth, Quebec, São Paulo. These became the front lines of a new era where exploration was no longer enough. Now the goal was settlement, exploitation, and control. The discoveries made during this period were staggering, not just geographic, but botanical, zoological, linguistic, and cultural. Europeans encountered foods that would eventually transform global cuisine: potatoes, tomatoes, corn, chocolate, tobacco. They found new diseases that would also transform global health, just not in a good way. They mapped coastlines, charted currents, and created the first truly global understanding of Earth's geography. But as we'll discuss, this came at a price that we're still reckoning with today: how it ended. So when did this whole thing wind down? The answer is, it didn't so much end as evolve. The age of exploration, as a distinct historical period, is generally considered to have concluded by the late 17th century. Several factors contributed to this transition. First, the mapping was mostly done. By the 1600s, Europeans had a pretty good idea of where most of the major land masses were. There were still blank spots on the map. Australia's full coastline wasn't mapped until the 1600s, and Antarctica wasn't properly explored until the 19th century. But the era of "we have no idea what's out there" was largely over. Second, exploration gave way to colonization. The focus shifted from finding new places to exploiting the places already found. European powers established permanent settlements, created colonial administrations, and developed complex systems of trade and resource extraction. The question was no longer what's out there, but how do we make as much money as possible from what we've found? Third, the geopolitical landscape changed. The Netherlands, England, and France rose to challenge Spain and Portugal. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, is often cited as a symbolic endpoint because it recognized the sovereignty of independent states and effectively ended the old medieval order, where the Pope essentially decided who owned what. Fourth, the Enlightenment shifted priorities. By the 18th century, the intellectual climate was changing. The scientific revolution emphasized systematic knowledge over gold hunting. Exploration continued, but it was increasingly driven by scientific curiosity rather than pure economic gain. But here's the honest truth: the age of exploration didn't really end, it transformed. The impulse to discover, conquer, and exploit that drove European explorers in the 15th century didn't disappear. It just found new expressions. The colonial empires that emerged from the age of exploration would dominate global politics until the 20th century. The trade networks established during this period became the foundation of the modern global economy. And the ideological frameworks, Eurocentrism, the civilizing mission, the idea that European powers had the right to claim any land they discovered, persisted for generations. In a very real sense, we're still living in the world that the age of exploration created. Lasting effects. This is where things get serious, because the legacy of the age of exploration is complicated. Actually, complicated might be the understatement of the millennium. The Columbian Exchange. Let's start with something that's at least partially positive. The Columbian Exchange refers to the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, and diseases between the Americas and the Old World. New World crops like potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and peanuts transformed Old World agriculture and helped fuel population growth. Simultaneously, Old World diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated indigenous American populations, killing an estimated 90% of Native Americans in the centuries following contact. There's no way to sugarcoat this. It was a demographic catastrophe on a scale rarely seen in human history. The Atlantic slave trade. One of the most horrific consequences of European exploration was the transatlantic slave trade. Starting in the 16th century and continuing for over 400 years, an estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. The economic systems built on enslaved labor, particularly in sugar, cotton, and tobacco production, made some European nations incredibly wealthy, while devastating African societies and causing intergenerational trauma, whose effects persist today. The rise of the global economy. The trade routes established during the Age of Exploration created the first true global economy. Silver from the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia flowed to China. Chinese porcelain arrived in European palaces. African slaves produced sugar that fed European appetites. The world became more interconnected than ever before, but the benefits were unevenly distributed. To put it mildly, European hegemony. Perhaps the most lasting effect was the establishment of European global dominance. By 1900, European powers controlled approximately 85% of the world's territory. This era of colonialism shaped everything from international borders to economic systems to cultural attitudes, and its effects are still visible today in issues ranging from political instability to economic inequality to cultural tensions. Cultural and scientific advances. On a more positive note, the Age of Exploration also led to enormous advances in navigation, cartography, astronomy, and shipbuilding. The knowledge gained during this period laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And the cultural exchanges, despite their often coercive nature, ultimately enriched human civilization in countless ways. The modern world. When you look at the world today, so much of what we take for granted has roots in the Age of Exploration. The foods we eat, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, coffee, all came from the Americas. The political boundaries of nations, particularly in the Americas and Africa, reflect colonial divisions. The English language itself is full of words borrowed from languages that explorers encountered. The globalized world we're living in? It started with a bunch of guys in wooden ships looking for a better deal on pepper. If this video sparked your curiosity about the Age of Exploration and its impact on our world, you'll love our deep dives into related topics. There's a playlist linked above. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you never miss a new video. History is full of stories that shape who we are today, and we're here to bring them to life. Thanks for watching. Bonus fact. And now for our bonus fact. The one piece of information that didn't quite fit into our main exploration, but is absolutely worth knowing. Here's something that surprises most people. The Age of Exploration almost didn't happen in the way we know it. In the early 1400s, China had the largest naval fleet in the world under the Ming Dynasty. Between 1405 and 1433, the famous Admiral Zheng He led massive maritime expeditions to Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and even East Africa. His ships were enormous. Some sources suggest they were up to 400 feet long, which would make them larger than most European ships for centuries to come. But then, in a decision that historians still debate, the Ming Dynasty abruptly ended the expeditions. China turned inward, focusing on domestic concerns and eventually implementing strict isolationist policies. The treasure ships were allowed to decay, and the navigational knowledge that had been gained was largely lost. So here's the thought experiment. What if Zheng He's voyages had continued? What if China had expanded its maritime empire instead of retreating? The entire history of the modern world might have been completely different, and we'd probably be watching videos about the Chinese Age of Exploration right now instead. It's a reminder that history isn't inevitable. Small decisions, or the absence of decisions, can change everything. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.